This morning our speaker is our brother Trent, and he's asked that we consider a reading from Luke, the 16th chapter. Luke 16, beginning at verse 19 to the end. There was a rich man who was clothed in purple and fine linen, and who feasted sumptuously every day. And at his gate was laid a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who desired to be fed with what fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, even the dogs came and licked his sores. The poor man died and was carried by the angels to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried. And in Hades, being in torment, he lifted up his eyes and saw Abraham far off and Lazarus at his side. And he called out, "Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus to dip the end of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in anguish in this flame." But Abraham said, "Child, remember that you in your lifetime received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner bad things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in anguish. And besides all this, between us and you a great chasm has been fixed, in order that those who would pass from here to you may not be able, and none may cross from there to us." And he said, "Then I beg you, Father, send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, so that he may warn them, lest they also come into this place of torment." But Abraham said, "They have Moses and the prophets, let them hear them." And he said, "No, Father Abraham, but if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent." He said to him, "If they do not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced if someone should rise from the dead." So with that reading, we will call upon our brother Trent, and his title this morning is God Helps. Brother Trent, you are welcome.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks for that welcome, which is such a nice thing that the Africans usually say when they get up here. You're welcome to speak. And I thank you for that. And I'm going to try to say some words I hope that are helpful today. And of course, the title is God Helps, and we'll get to why that title is here shortly. Jesus told a lot of parables. Last week, our brother Robert talked about the prodigal son, and that's an interesting parable. I want to ask you, how many of you have a favorite parable, and how many have the rich man and Lazarus as their favorite parable? Nobody. And you might wonder why that is. I think you probably don't wonder why that is. You probably have a good idea why that's not your favorite parable. In my mind, at one point, I thought I would like to cut it out of my Bible and dispose of it. I think when I was in college, I had a discussion / argument with some people from another church, and it was very difficult when we got to this passage. And I'm teaching the high schoolers this year, and some of them said, like, this is the first time I've read this. And they weren't familiar with it at all. And I think that probably says something about us, because we kind of avoid this parable. It's not, I don't know, it's just not something that maybe we don't know how to explain it, or we don't get the lesson out of it. So what is the lesson of this story? And you know, I'm actually going to ask you that. And first, I want you to say, is it about doctrine? Is it about theology? Or is it about behavior? What do you think? Who says behavior? Raise your hand. Who says it's about doctrine? We have one. Robert Frisbee says it's about doctrine. Well, actually, I think it's about both. And in some ways, they're interconnected here. And I do think it is a parable. There are the people that I was arguing with said, no, this isn't a parable. This really happened. But I think it's pretty clear that it is a parable. The only things that are different about this that make you wonder is that they have a person actually named in this parable. He has a proper name, and it is what? Lazarus. And there's another person in there with a proper name, one we know that was real. And who is that? Abraham, right? You have two people that existed. But for most of us, we don't think that the Lazarus of this parable matches up with the Lazarus from real life, or at least we don't think this is necessarily a biography of his life, a brief biography. So let's take a look at this parable. And the name Lazarus means whom God helps. So that's where the title comes from. This is a man in the parable who God did help, but not in his life, right? Not in his lifetime. He's a very pitiful person who seems to have some illness, and he sits at the gate of this rich man, and he just hopes to get scraps from the rich man's meals. And it appears to be a miserable life, and it says even the dogs come up and lick his wounds, which you can think about that. I'll maybe talk briefly about that. If I don't, we're not missing anything. But so after he's had this, what seems like an awful life, he dies. And no good thing seems to have happened during his life. And we have another person in this parable. It's a rich man. And he seems to enjoy life. He's got plenty to eat, plenty of material blessings. And he just goes through life. He's got this man sitting at his gate. We don't even know. He seems to acknowledge him. After they both die, he knows who he is, but the guy sits at his gate, and I guess he gives some scraps once in a while, or somebody from his household does, but he dies as well. So both of them died, and then we get to the part where we kind of get uneasy about this whole parable, because they're both now expressing their thoughts after they're dead. And we're kind of thinking that shouldn't happen. You know, why is Jesus telling a parable where these people are still alive? And it seems like. And one goes to Abraham's bosom, and that is Lazarus, and the other one, the rich man, is tormented. He's got flames around him, and he's suffering. And so the rich man says, hey, I don't like this. You know, what happened here? He says, tell Lazarus to come here and just put some water on his fingertip or something, and you know, and you wonder what that means, and maybe that's what he did for Lazarus, which is pretty pathetic, but he says, at least send Lazarus here to do that for me. Give me a little bit of water. And Abraham says, nope, can't do it. You know, you've lived your life in ease and comfort, and Lazarus had a pretty awful life. So Lazarus is here in Abraham's bosom, and as Abraham is speaking, he would say, Abraham's here with me, or Lazarus is here with me, and you have to suffer. And he says, well, I didn't know it was going to be like this. You know, somebody should have warned me. And he says, at least send somebody back to warn my brothers. He said, and Abraham refuses. He says, no, you had Moses and the prophets. They told you plenty. So no, he continues to say, no, please send somebody back. Send somebody back from the dead to warn them. And then Abraham says, if we sent somebody back from the dead, they wouldn't listen because they already were told these things. And that's the gist of the parable. So, you know, as you're reading this, you think, I don't understand. You know, this is not, we haven't heard about Abraham's bosom anywhere else in the Bible that's like a place of reward. And we never thought anybody's tormented. And I think by doing that, we kind of miss the point of the parable, which is, I think, mainly about behavior. It's about how this poor man was treated and how the rich man lived his life. The rich man just enjoyed life. And I think earlier on, and this chapter especially, and even the parable about the prodigal son, I think they're dealing with how people live their lives and how they want to enjoy the blessings that this life can give us, and how it's not good for us. In Luke 16, verse 14, it says, the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, heard all this, and they scoffed at him. So they, I don't know if you would go up to a Pharisee in those days and say, are you a lover of money? And they would say, oh, sure, yeah, I am. They might not think they are, but all their actions showed that they were. And again, the previous parable is about the shrewd steward, who I think is an example of, because what that steward does in the parable in Luke 16, 1 through 9, is he squanders the goods that his rich employer entrusted him with. He had all sorts of wealth, but it wasn't his. And then the employer says, the rich man that is employing him says, what are you doing with all my goods? You're fired. And he says, so it says that he went out and shrewdly went to all the debtors of his former employer and said, you know, you owed 100, whatever, only pay 80, and that'll be satisfactory. And by doing this with several of the rich man's debtors, he made some connections, and of course he made those people happy. And in the end, the rich man says, you are a very shrewd person to be doing that. And But I think the whole point of that parable was that you forgave people their debts when the rich man had not done that. You know, they owed 100, and he said, well, if you pay 80, that's enough. And I think that it was the same thing with the Pharisees. They had taken their law and said, well, if you do this much right with the law, then you're good. You know, you're good with God. And God never said that. He always said, you know, if you're going to go by the law, you have to pay the full price. And if you don't, then you're dead. So they had, in my mind, in that first parable, it was an example of how they had corrupted things for their benefit. And all the people looked at them as, oh, these guys are great because they tell me I'm okay. And the people were not okay. Their debt had not been cleansed, and we know the only way to get your debt forgiven is for God just to say it's gone, and that's only through Christ. So I think these chapters are about that. And now we get to this parable, and he's really dealing with how much they have corrupted their theology and doctrines for the sake of their love for money and blessings and riches. At the end of that first parable about the unjust steward or shrewd steward, in verse 9 he says, I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous mammon, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal habitations, right? And I think maybe King James says, into the eternal darkness. That's a lot different than what we read in the rich man and Lazarus. And I think the one that is explained, the eternal darkness or the eternal nothing, is the correct approach. And now when we get into the rich man and Lazarus, and you know, I don't want to distract too much from the main lesson, we are getting into a corrupted theology that these people have. And here's how I think it would go in the mind of a Pharisee if he was telling this same parable. He would say there was a rich man and there was someone sitting at his gate. The rich man did all he could for that poor man, but that man was a sinner, and he received the just rewards for his sins. So his poorness, his illnesses, and all those were deserved by him. And the rich man was nice enough to give him some scraps that God had blessed him with. And so both men died, and the rich man, of course, was taken into Abraham's bosom. He was a child of Abraham, and he was a seed, and the blessings just continued on. His blessings in real life continued on as he, was part of the afterlife. And this poor scoundrel, he would probably call him, he got what he deserved. He's being tormented now for what he did. So I think that's the way it developed. Josephus says in his historical book that was the theology of the Pharisees of the time, that they just thought, yeah, of course why wouldn't we be rewarded for what we did in this life? And I think Jesus just says, that's all wrong. You didn't even consider what God really wants, and it is laid out in the law and the prophets that you can't forget about poor people. In fact, that God does not forget. And how many times, and this is I think the main point of the parable, how many times does God say you have to take care of those people? How many times does it take you to understand that God cares for the widows and the orphans? How many different ways did he say that in the Bible? And then, of course, he says, Abraham in this parable, and the weird thing about this is, why would Abraham be talking about Moses and the prophets? It just seems very strange for him to be telling them about Moses and the prophets, who obviously came after Abraham. Why wouldn't Abraham say, can't you just look at my life and see, how I treated people and how it was a life of faith, not a life of whatever, following the law. But I think they looked at Abraham because he was rich, and the Bible said he was rich. So, why would Abraham reject them? And I think we know the reason is because Abraham did not act like he was rich, or did not assume that anything he was given should be used for anything other than God's glory. So that's what I think this parable is about. And there's a point at the end of the parable when he says, if somebody was sent from the dead, you still wouldn't believe them. And of course, that's where I think the real Lazarus comes in. So what about the real Lazarus? And I say the real Lazarus. Maybe there's some things from the parable that this Lazarus had in common with the real Lazarus. But what about him? What do we know about the real Lazarus? And here's a point, again, where you can answer. What do you know about the real Lazarus? Bits and pieces of information that you can tell me about him.
He was one of Jesus' good friends.
He was a good friend of Jesus. Yeah. So we'll get into that in a second. Anything else? Right. Do you know what was wrong with him? I don't know if we know what was wrong with him. We just know that he got really sick and died. Right? Anything else we know? The real Lazarus.
Brother of Mary and Martha.
Right, he's the brother of Mary and Martha. So there's a connection there that can maybe lead us to more information. And anything else that you know about the real Lazarus? So he was raised from the dead. Jesus loved him. That's going to be an important thing to consider. Robert?
I'm going to take a wild guess here. I think I remember. Was he in Bethany? Is that where?
He lived in Bethany, apparently.
I'm wondering if this parable, I can't remember if this parable was being told near that region.
I don't think we know. So, good guess. Look into it some more. Maybe that's true. Who knows? Chuck, what were you going to say?
I would infer that Lazarus was a good man and a believer.
Yeah, at least by you. Yeah, I think that's true. Sue?
Pharisees wanted to kill him.
Right. That's an important thing. I think that especially fits in with this parable. So there was a man raised from the dead, and what happened with him? It says the Pharisees, and let's just take a look at that in John chapter 12. So John chapter 11 is about the resurrection of Lazarus. And we see that that's where they lived in 11:1. It says, a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. And in verse 2, it's just stick this in your mind too. It was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. So they all live in Bethany, right? And then we get in chapter 12. It says, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. There they made him a supper. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those at table with him. Mary took a pound of costly ointment of pure nard and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the ointment. And that's when Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, he who was to betray him, said, why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor? This he said, not that he cared for the poor, but because he was a thief. And as he had the money box, he used to take what was put into it. Jesus said, let her alone. Let her keep it for the day of my burial. The poor you always have with you, but you do not always have me. And so in verse 9, it says, when the great crowd of the Jews learned that he was there, they came not only on account of Jesus, but also to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. So the chief priests planned to put Lazarus also to death, because on account of him, many of the Jews were going away and believing in Jesus. So this very man who Jesus raised from the dead, they said, let's figure out a plan so we can kill him. We'll kill the both of them, because this has gone too far. Everybody's following them. So we're going to kill Lazarus and Jesus, which always seems strange, because if Jesus had actually raised Lazarus from the dead, they could kill him and he could just keep raising him. It just seems like they hadn't really thought things through, and of course they hadn't. But the whole thing is, their view of how God treated people and how he treated them was so warped by this point that they're conspiring to kill this man Lazarus and the Son of God, that they are so messed up. So it's just like the parable said, even if we sent a man back from the dead, you wouldn't believe him, because you already have plenty of evidence to tell you otherwise. And I think one of the big things that blinded them was this whole idea of blessings of wealth and riches, and they didn't want any of that upset. So here is the real Lazarus, and I was trying to piece all these things together, and maybe somebody has it better, but it appears that this event is in Simon the leper's house when they're in Bethany, because that Simon invited Jesus to dinner, and that's when it appears that Mary anointed Jesus. And there's some dispute about this, and I don't want to get into it too much, but it appears that both these families and some people think maybe they're the same family, that they all lived in Bethany. And but we know one thing, that Mary is a sinner. Like, that's how she's tagged. And now Lazarus, her brother, is also on their list of of people to be wiped out. So we have two people from that family, Mary and Lazarus, who are on the bad list for the Pharisees. So let's think about this now. So Lazarus is, we know a couple things about him now. He lived in Bethany. He's at this dinner, and apparently there's Pharisees at the table there that could have asked him anything they wanted to know about his death and resurrection. They could have said, "Were you in Abraham's bosom? Like, is that what we believe really true?" And he would have said, no. It was complete darkness, and then I was raised, called from the tomb. I couldn't really tell you what was going on and in between, but because nothing was going on with him. He could have answered all their questions, but I don't think they asked him any questions like that. They just wanted to get rid of him. Now, was the real Lazarus poor? You might wonder. We know that he was ill, and maybe he maybe he had sores like the one in the parable, but I think it would be really difficult to say that he was poor. And I think one reason is because of Mary. His sister has this precious ointment, that is worth a lot of money, and she has no concern for that at all. And Mary was like the black sheep of the family. And if she has this precious ointment, it's like maybe Lazarus isn't a poor person. And in dealing with the rich, if you remember, let's take a look at Mark 10. This is one of several places that it talks about a rich young man coming up to Jesus. So in Mark 10, let's see if I got this right. Yeah, we'll just skip down to, it starts in verse 17, where someone came up and knelt before him and asked him, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit life?" And he tells him, follow the law, pretty much. And he says, I did all these. And it says in verse 21, Jesus, looking upon him, loved him and said to him, "You lack one thing. Go sell what you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. And come, follow me." At that saying, his countenance fell, and he went away sorrowful, for he had great possessions. And so what I'm going to suggest to you today is, like what C said. C said that the one thing that Jesus says about Lazarus is what? He loved him, right? He loved that whole family. And I was thinking, how many places does Jesus come out and say he loves someone? We know that he loves us, but sometimes he specifically says that, and I can only think of a couple of times. And this is one, and when he's talking about going to see, going to Bethany, and when he eventually ends up raising Lazarus from the dead, he talks about his love for that whole family. He says he loves Mary and Martha and Lazarus. So my suggestion here, and you can take it or leave it, is that Lazarus might be the rich young man that came to Jesus and said, what should I do? You know, and Jesus looked at him and loved him. Looked at him. So you think, well, that's a pretty flimsy connection, and I kind of agree. But I think how appropriate would it be that in this story, Lazarus, the real Lazarus, played the part of both the rich man and the poor man. You know, and who knows, and that's the only connection. And but I think it's interesting that it says this about the rich young man that came up to him, that he loved him. And I don't think that love would just like stop, that wouldn't be the end of the story with this rich young man that came to him, and that Jesus would foster this relationship. And possibly by the time, you know, when Lazarus does get sick, and Jesus says, I'm not going, and he's waiting pretty much for Lazarus to die. And finally, when Lazarus dies, then he says, okay, now I'm going. So that just a possibility that Jesus was working with Lazarus, and he ended up being the one that he raised from the dead. And of course, at that point, Lazarus would say, I'll give up anything. I think it would be a nice story, even if it's not true. And yeah, so take that with a grain of salt, but it would be interesting if that was the case. And I know a lot of people have other theories about who this rich young man was, and it doesn't say, and you wonder why wouldn't he just say that it was Lazarus? But I was wondering about that with Mary in other circumstances. There's obviously places where it's Mary that's, you know, washing his feet and anointing Jesus, and they say a woman came in. Well, why didn't you just tell us it's Mary? And you think, I don't know why. So they never say who this rich young man was. So that's just a little thing to offer, but that's the only one. And you know, John later on says the disciple who Jesus loved, and everybody thinks that's John, but I was reading somewhere where some said, well, why wouldn't it be Lazarus? And so you can think about that as well, because it was someone that Jesus loved. And there's no indication really that he's poor. And I guess I'd always thought that Mary and Martha and Lazarus were just getting by, but there's no indication of that. It seems like maybe that's not true. There's a big turnout for his funeral, pretty much, and so you wonder why that would be if he was kind of a lower level nobody. But anyway, that maybe even gets away from the point of this parable, and I really want to emphasize this. The point of the parable is, in my mind, that we should not be concerned about riches, and maybe it warps our doctrine as well. Maybe we think, like, I'd like to just live out this life in comfort and go right into the kingdom. In fact, if Jesus comes before I die, maybe I won't even have to experience that. Maybe I can just glide right into the kingdom, have a nice, happy, comfortable life, and there I'll be forever, you know. Right in, maybe we don't say Abraham's bosom, but maybe we think, you know, Jesus' bosom, just like John was at the Last Supper. Maybe I'll just cruise right in there. And over again, we're told, don't think like that. I mean, how many times do we have to be told, don't think like that? How many times can you think of in the Bible where it says, you know, your doctrine isn't as important as your behavior? How many times do we have to be told that? It is important, but if it doesn't affect our behavior, then it's worthless. I mean, that's what Paul said. All those things I used to believe, that's garbage, that's dung in my life. I used to think, you know, that all those, I had everything right and in order. He goes, but I was wrong. It was, and you could see it in his behavior. He was out trying to kill people. He was at the stoning of Stephen. So does this happen with us? You know, how many times do we have to be told that what you have is not that important? In fact, he says to the rich young man, give it all away. Give it to the poor. It doesn't matter, it's meaningless. If you follow me, that is important. And, you know, I know that I'm not doing that well in that category. I always think about how I can save up for my retirement, or how, you know, I have to have some money in my nest egg. And Jesus had none of that. He didn't worry about any of that. And, you know, his apostles didn't worry about that in the end. Maybe there was a time when they did, but pretty much they gave up all their worldly goods and were not concerned at all about them. So, you know, and it is true that we can't all just give our money away, and I guess it's true, I don't know. Maybe we could all give it a try, but it's just that, you know, if we know all these things and don't care for the poor, if we don't understand exactly how God cares for us, that he, you know, despite all of our failings, he still cares for us and helps us through. Despite all these things, God cares for us. And he says, he tells us all the time, and Jesus himself says, why are you anxious about what's going to happen tomorrow? Just worry about today. And yet we do, and maybe we do contort our doctrines and whatever to fit what we hope happens to us. I know I have to rethink this, because this parable, I think it really emphasizes that, and I think that's why it's going to move up on my list of favorite parables, that Jesus says, look, this is what happened, you know, this guy was totally wrong, and it was too late by the time he died, this rich man, to do anything about it. So you have to do something about it now while you're still living. Don't be greedy, don't hoard, don't think that money is the all-important thing, and just, you know, be ready to help people constantly, because it doesn't matter to God. He'll help you as long as you keep going in that direction. So that was Lazarus' name, God helps. And it's really whom God helps. And I think, you know, we should think about that ourselves and take that name. Because anything we have, it's because God has helped us, and especially in our spiritual lives. Finally, and I'll just end with this, here's what Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, just to re-emphasize one more way that Jesus told us how to behave. Seeing the crowds, he went up on the mountain, and when he sat down, his disciples came to him, and he opened his mouth, and he taught them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." That's the first thing he says. Blessed are the poor in spirit. And you would think, wouldn't you say, blessed are the rich in spirit? But that's not his point, really. It's not how much spirit you have, it's your attitude. If you have a spirit of like where you think in terms of how, poor you are, that you have the same mind as a poor person, I think you will behave much differently than if you think you have them, I'm blessed with these riches and I deserve it, because I serve God and he's blessed me with all these things. It's interesting that the first thing he says is, blessed are the poor in spirit, and theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So that maybe gives you a little room that you can, and I hope you don't think like that. Well, I am poor in spirit, because sometimes I think like that. Well, I don't really have any problems, so I can keep my riches and still be poor in spirit, and I'll be fine. But don't think like that. Think like Jesus is saying here. The one who is going to be in the kingdom or given the kingdom is the one who thinks like that always, the one who is poor in spirit. And of course, he goes on to say all these other things. And you would think, oh, Trent got up there and said, don't worry about doctrine or anything. No, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying the thing that God counts most important is not how much wealth you've accumulated. And we all know this, but our behavior has to show that we don't just walk by a Lazarus sitting at the gate and just give him scraps or whatever. Maybe if we think about it. We have to bless others as God has blessed us. So in your quest to please God, remember that. Remember Lazarus and his name. God helps, and he'll help you. If you gave all your goods away, he would still help you and be with you. And you would probably notice, I got them all back. How did that happen? And then you could give them away again. But God does help, and I hope we remember that, especially as we remember the greatest gift that God has given us, his son Jesus.